3 Mustangs and dozens of their antelope buddies slogged around in a muddy depression on the enormous Tonopah test range in the summer of 2008. Just days after BLM contractors had captured and removed every other horse they could find, hundreds of them, in a roundup that BLM said was absolutely necessary.
There's basically no grass. The animals are eating brush, and after a while they go down in condition and die of starvation on the range.
To the untrained eye, the Tonopah horses sure didn't look like they were starving. That's because they weren't. The fact is, there's more than enough water and food for horse herds on this range, the very first range designated for Mustangs under the 1971 law. A mere 100 yards from the mud hole where Mustangs pawed for moisture is an oasis of foliage around a lush, clear water pond. The well that feeds the pond is operated by the BLM, which installed barbed wire fencing to keep wildlife out, especially horses. In the same valley, also on BLM land, water-intensive alfalfa farms operate. To our knowledge, BLM hasn't proposed any roundups of antelope to protect the herds that roam the same area. Critics allege the BLM has repeatedly engineered or otherwise contributed to the conditions on public ranges, which are later used to justify the removal of horses. Fences have cut the horses off from water and forage all over the West, which BLM then uses as a reason to round them up. Overall, BLM has gathered 250,000 horses off the public range, but what's happening now is different from previous years, both in scale and long-term intent, and it's happening with virtually no oversight.
And they're just saying, okay, we'll do what you want. We finally just totally cave in. And what the public doesn't realize is these greatly reduced herd management areas are already a very serious reduction. But now they're just going for broke, you know. They're just saying, yeah, I'll get rid of them.
We've decreased the number of wild horses on the range by over 50% in 20 years. You know, for those people that say, well, these horses are just out of control, the numbers are out of control, there isn't anything out there that's realized a 50% decrease in the last 2 decades. Certainly not the number of cattle that are out there.
By almost any measure, there's been a dramatic shift. The pace of the government roundups has jumped over the last several years, averaging more than 9,000 head per year. As of early 2009, there are more than 33,000 horses in places like Ridgecrest, California, or Fallon, Nevada. More horses than exist on the open range. Once they get to government corrals like this one, they are essentially no longer wild horses. They're wards of the state, welfare horses, living off the public dole. And for the rest of their lives, they'll be warehoused, either in government pens like this or on private ranches. BLM spends more than half of its total budget to feed captured Mustangs. Places like the Fallon facility are supposed to be for short-term holding, though horses can stay there for years. It's a crummy situation for the horses and for taxpayers, since keeping a horse at one of these facilities is expensive. Less expensive are the long-term facilities, that is, private ranches in Oklahoma and Kansas, but it means millions of dollars are paid each year to big landowners who do very little for the money. BLM complained in 2008 that it could no longer afford to feed the horses and that it was considering mass euthanizations of the Mustangs. And yet, despite its budget woes, BLM keeps gathering more and more.
You've got another 30,000 locked up in pens, and that's not what the public envisioned for the life of the wild horse.
Nevada Congresswoman Dina Titus is one of the few in Congress willing to criticize the BLM wild horse program, which she describes as an absolute failure.
The worse the problem gets, the harder it is to solve, so the more likely BLM is just to push it off and do nothing. That's why you have the roundups. That's mostly just about elimination of the horse, not elimination of the problem.
When pressed about wild horse policies, BLM officials resort to what now sounds like a mantra. It's all about managing.
We want our children and our children's children to be able to go out on public lands and see wild herds of horses and burros. But they have to be managed.
It is, in fact, our mission to manage and protect these wild horses.
Our role is managing the horses, so what we have to do is make sure that they are at an appropriate management level.
Our primary purpose is to manage the wild horses on the public land.
We have to manage the horses. We're trying to manage healthy rangelands. We really are.
But managing the horses has come to mean one thing: rounding them up. The primary tool used by BLM to justify horse gatherers is something called AML, Appropriate Management Level. It's supposed to work like this. BLM scientists and experts put their boots on the ground, study the range, evaluate forage and water, count the horses and other wildlife, and figure out if there are enough resources to go around without damaging the land. They develop a baseline number of horses that are recommended for a particular herd management area, or HMA. In reality, critics say, AML is a crapshoot, a guessing game, numbers that are easily and frequently manipulated.
It has nothing to do with what's really on the ground.
John Phillips, one of the first BLM wild horse specialists, says that from the beginning of the program, AML figures were influenced by and manipulated for cattlemen. He saw it for himself.
It was just the reaction from these other users that did not want the horse to have an equal status or a better status.
Longtime wild horse activist Don Lappin, who worked closely with Wild Horse Annie in implementing the 1971 law, helped author a blistering assessment of BLM's range studies. The report from the Nevada Commission on Wild Horses uncovered numerous instances where numbers were fudged or influenced by the ranching industry. Lappin told us back in 1997 that BLM was caught red-handed contracting out its range planning to a cattle industry front. Not surprisingly, the recommendation was to get rid of a lot of horses.
That private contractor serves as consultants to the livestock industry. And so it is the Bureau's job to do this work.
I believe that they're avoiding relying on science.
Wild horse advocate Jerry Reynoldson went to federal court in 2007 to stop a planned BLM roundup on the grounds that the Bureau failed to do any real research. That effort failed because the horse advocates couldn't afford their own scientific experts to counter BLM. But Reynoldson says any impartial review of the last several years would show the AML has little connection to the number of horses gathered up.
That's what we see happening. In good range conditions and bad range conditions, the same decisions seem to be made. I don't think there are compelling scientific arguments for gathering these horses. I think they're gathering these horses. It makes room for more cattle, and it just takes care of a problem that they would rather not have.
The most disturbing trend of all, horse advocates say, is the new policy of removing all horses in a herd management area. These HMAs were created under the 1971 law and are supposed to be home to horses forever. In Nevada and elsewhere, BLM has decided that the original law was simply mistaken, or that conditions have changed and that the horses do not belong on these lands anymore. The current campaign in Nevada will zero out 1.4 million acres.
And we're going to pull those horses out, and again, just as a proactive measure.
Basically zeroing it out.
Basically zeroing it out.
The horses that were rounded up near Ely certainly look healthy, not emaciated. BLM admits the range is also healthy. Removing healthy horses from healthy range in order to meet an arbitrary number, is this the future of the wild horse program? Coming up later.
It was absolutely illegal.